Victor Whitmore's voice cut through the frozen morning like a blade. Burn it. 2 words. That was all it took. His ranch hand hesitated, glancing at the small cabin where lamplight still flickered behind a frost-crusted window. A child's shadow moved across the glass. Sir, there's kids in there. Victor didn't look up from his ledger. I said burn it. The land transfers Monday. Anything still standing on it is trespassing. The ranch hand turned away. He told himself later that he didn't know what would have happened if the rider hadn't come, if the snow hadn't slowed them down, if one man with nothing but a horse and a bad conscience hadn't turned back. But on that morning, in that silence, Victor Whitmore gave an order to destroy a family's only shelter in the middle of a Wyoming winter. And he didn't blink once. If that had been your family's home, your brothers, your little sister, everything you'd built with your own hands, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this one move you, if they remind you that some fights are worth everything, hit that subscribe button and follow along to the very end. You will not want to miss what happens next. And after you watch, leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. But the snow had been falling for 3 days without stopping when Caleb Whitmore rode past the boundary markers his father had planted the previous autumn. He wasn't supposed to be out this far. His father's orders were clear. Stay close to the main ranch, manage the hands, oversee the feed inventory. Winter on the Wyoming range was not a time for wandering. Victor Whitmore ran his operation like a military campaign, and soldiers did not go exploring. But Caleb had been restless since October. A particular kind of restlessness that had no clean name. Not boredom exactly, not loneliness, though it carried pieces of both. Something closer to the feeling of wearing a coat that had never quite fit, no matter how many times it was altered. He was 26 years old. He had more money behind his name than most men in the territory would see in 5 lifetimes. And he felt, most mornings, like a man slowly suffocating inside a very well-furnished room. He rode northeast because there was nothing northeast. No other ranches, no settlements of any consequence, just the long white silence of the high country. His horse, a dark bay gelding named Fletcher, moved steadily through the drifts, his breath fogging the air in rhythmic clouds. Caleb let him pick the pace. He almost missed it. The cabin was set back from a shallow creek bed, half hidden by a stand of bare cottonwoods. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, thin, barely there smoke, the kind that comes from a fire that doesn't have much left to burn. The structure itself was in poor condition, even at a distance. One corner of the roof sagged, the door was hung slightly crooked in its frame. A section of the front wall had been patched with what looked like feed sacking nailed over bare timber. Caleb pulled Fletcher to a stop. He sat there for a moment, looking at the smoke, looking at the light that came from the single window, looking at the shape of the place. Small, struggling, but clearly inhabited, clearly someone's home. He should have turned around. That was the sensible thing, the thing his father would have told him to do. You didn't ride up to a stranger's cabin in the middle of winter unannounced. Not out here. People in the backcountry were territorial by necessity, and a man on horseback approaching without warning could expect a rifle barrel through a cracked door before he got close enough to say good morning. But the smoke was so thin. He rode forward. He was still 30 yards out when the door opened. She didn't come out with a rifle, which surprised him. She came out with an axe, not raised, held at her side, handle gripped low, like someone who'd carried one enough to know it didn't need to be theatrical to be serious. She stood on the step in a coat that was too large for her, her dark hair pulled back from her face, and she looked at him the way people look at weather they're not sure about. "Stop there," she said. Her voice was steady, not frightened, just clear. Caleb stopped. He raised one hand, palm out, and kept the other loose on the reins. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "No, nobody ever says they are." He couldn't argue with that. "My name's Caleb Whitmore. I was riding the North Range. I saw your smoke. I didn't know anyone was settled out this far." Something shifted in her expression at the name. Just a flicker, there and gone. "Whitmore," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she looked past him, scanning the tree line, the creek, the open ground behind where he'd come from, checking whether he'd brought company. He hadn't. "How many of you?" she asked. "Just me." Another pause. The wind picked up, throwing a skiff of snow between them. She didn't flinch. Clara, a child's voice from inside the cabin, urgent and trying to be quiet at the same time. I hear you, Eli. She didn't take her eyes off Caleb. Stay inside. Caleb kept his hands visible and his posture as unthreatening as a man on horseback could manage. Is everyone all right? That fire doesn't look like it's... We're fine. She said it too fast. The way people say things when they're not fine but have decided that fine is the only answer available to them. He looked at her hands. The knuckles were cracked and red from the cold. Her boots were old, the leather splitting at one side. The coat she was wearing, too large, probably a man's coat, had been mended at the collar with mismatched thread. I've got supplies in my pack, he said carefully. Some salt pork, dried beans, coffee. I'm not going to offer them like charity because I can see that would go over badly, but I also can't ride away knowing that fire's about to go out. Clara Bennett looked at him for what felt like a very long time. Then she said, What do you want for them? It wasn't quite a question. Nothing, he said. She made a short sound, not quite a laugh, more the sound of someone dismissing something they've heard too many times. Men like you don't come out to the back country with supplies and want nothing. Men like me, he said. You don't know me. I know your father's name. That landed differently than he expected. He felt it somewhere in his chest, the particular weight of being known entirely through someone else. Then you probably think you know what I am, he said. I think I have a reasonable idea. He sat with that for a moment. Fletcher shifted beneath him, impatient with the cold. Then Caleb reached slowly into his pack, watching her watch him, and drew out a canvas sack. He leaned down and set it in the snow, a few feet from Fletcher's front hooves. I'm not going to argue the point, he said. That's there if you want it. I'll go. He started to turn Fletcher around. Wait. He stopped. Clara Bennett stood in the snow in her too large coat and looked at the canvas sack and then looked at him. Her jaw was tight. He could see the pride working against the practicality in her face, those two things at war with each other, neither one winning clean. The children haven't eaten since yesterday morning, she said. She didn't say it like she was asking for sympathy. She said it like she was stating a fact, giving him information he needed to understand the situation, handing him something that had cost her considerably to say out loud. Caleb didn't say anything. He just nodded once and climbed down from Fletcher. The inside of the cabin was cold enough that he could see his breath. The fire in the hearth was barely more than coals, a few thin sticks arranged over them, trying their best to catch. 3 children sat near it in a cluster, 2 boys and a girl, ranging maybe from 5 years old to 10 or 11. They had blankets pulled around their shoulders, and they stared at Caleb with the wide, unblinking attention that children give to things they are not sure are safe. The eldest boy, the one who'd called through the door, watched Caleb with something harder than curiosity. He was maybe 11, dark-haired like his sister, with the kind of expression on his face that belongs on someone twice his age. This is Eli, Claire said. She was moving behind Caleb, building the fire back up with some of the wood from the pile by the door. And Hannah. And the little one is Thomas. Thomas was 5, maybe 6. He had a smear of something on one cheek and a piece of frayed rope he was turning over in his hands like a puzzle. He looked at Caleb, then at the canvas sack, then at Caleb again. Is that food? He asked. Thomas, Clara started. It's all right, Caleb said. He set the sack on the rough-cut table and began unpacking it. Salt pork, beans, some coffee, and a tin of sugar. He paused and pulled out a smaller cloth bundle. And jerky. That's probably faster if anyone's hungry right now. He set the jerky on the table and stepped back. Thomas was already off his blanket. Hannah grabbed the back of his shirt. Manners, she said firmly, in exactly the tone of an older sibling who has had to say this word many more times than should have been necessary. Thomas stood still. He looked at the jerky. He looked at Caleb. Thank you, he said, with the careful enunciation of a child reciting something important. You're welcome, Caleb said. He looked around the cabin while Clara got a pot going over the rebuilt fire. The space was small, one room, with a sleeping area curtained off at the back. A few shelves held what looked like the remnants of a more stocked pantry, mostly empty now. Tools hung on the wall, well maintained despite everything else. There was a Bible on the shelf with a cracked spine, a small mirror, and a tin frame holding what might have been a portrait, though Caleb didn't look closely enough to be certain. Eli had not moved from his spot by the fire. "You ride for your father?" Eli asked. "I work with him," Caleb said. "It's not quite the same thing." Eli looked at him with the eyes of someone who suspected that distinction didn't amount to much. "His men came out here in October," he said. "Left papers. Said we were on land that had already been claimed." Caleb's stomach tightened. "What kind of papers?" "Clara said they were wrong." "Eli." Clara's voice was quiet but firm. Eli pressed his mouth shut, but the look he gave Caleb didn't change. Caleb moved to the table and sat down carefully on one of the unsteady chairs. He wasn't sure what he'd walked into. He wasn't sure now how to walk back out. "How long have you been here?" he asked Clara. She was stirring the pot, not looking at him. 3 years. We came out with our parents in the spring of '82. "And your parents?" "Fever." She said it flat and quick, the way people say things they've already grieved past the point of drama. "Last January, both of them." The room went quiet, except for the fire and the wind working at the gaps in the walls. Thomas had settled back onto his blanket with a piece of jerky held in both hands, gnawing at it with total concentration. "So it's been you," Caleb said. "It's been us," she said. She looked at him then, just briefly. "There's a difference." He understood that she meant the children, that she was telling him, without sentimentality, that she did not count herself separately from them, that the pronoun was important. He nodded. "What was on those papers?" She set down her spoon. She went to the shelf and took down a folded document from behind the Bible, and she set it on the table in front of him. He didn't want to read it, but he did. It took him only a moment to understand what he was looking at. He recognized the legal language because he'd grown up hearing his father's lawyers use it. A notice of competing land claim, filed in October through a land office 2 counties over, citing a prior survey that established the northeastern acreage, the acreage they were sitting on right now, as part of the Whitmore Ranch's intended expansion. His father's name was on it. Of course it was. Caleb set the paper down slowly. He became aware that Clara was watching him, and he became aware, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that she had already known whose name was on this document, that she had known it when he said his name out in the snow, that she had let him in anyway because the children needed to eat, and she was practical enough to separate those two facts. "This isn't valid," he said. "I know it isn't," she said. "The claim is built on a survey that has the creek in the wrong place. The original homestead filing we made with the land office in '82 puts us on the right side of it. But filing a counterclaim costs money. Having a lawyer look at it costs money." She sat down across from him. "We haven't had money since before the fever." Caleb looked at the document again. Then he looked at the 3 children. Thomas still working on his jerky, Hannah watching him with careful eyes, Eli sitting with his arms crossed and his expression doing everything it could to communicate that he didn't trust this man and didn't intend to. He looked at Clara. She looked back at him without any performance. No appeal, no vulnerability arranged for his benefit. Just a woman waiting to see what he would do. "I'm going to need to look at the original filing," he said. "Do you have it?" "I have everything," she said. "My father kept records of everything." So, they ate together, beans and salt pork. Not fancy, but hot and filling. And while the children ate, Caleb looked through the papers Clara's father had kept in a tin box under the floor. The homestead filing, the survey notes, letters to the land office, a receipt from the county clerk dated April of 1882, payment for the original claim. The documentation was clean, better than clean. It was meticulous. Her father had been thorough in a way that suggested he'd understood, even then, that the frontier was not a place that gave things away for free. You had to be able to prove what you'd done. "Your father was careful," Caleb said. "He was a school teacher before he came west," Clara said. She was at the other end of the table, watching the children with the habitual attention of someone who has learned to track 3 different small disasters at once. He believed in writing things down. "That's going to matter." She looked at him. "You sound like you mean that." "I do." She studied him for a moment. There was something in her expression that wasn't quite distrust anymore, something closer to a question she hadn't decided to ask yet. "What is it?" Caleb said. "You're his son," she said. "Yes." "So why?" "Because this isn't right," he said. He said it simply, without any inflation. "And I know it isn't right. and I have the ability to do something about it. That's the only reason." She looked at him steadily. He had the distinct impression she was measuring the truth of that against some internal scale. He didn't blame her. He was aware, sitting in this cabin, that his last name carried more weight than he wanted it to, and not the good kind. "I'm not going to become a problem you have to manage," she said. "I appreciate the food, but if you're going to try to help, I need you to understand that I make the decisions about what happens to this family, not you." "Understood," he said. Eli looked up from his bowl. He looked at Caleb with the expression of someone revising their opinion, not dropping their guard, but filing something away. Thomas tugged at Hannah's sleeve. "Is he coming back?" he whispered, in the way children whisper, which is to say quite audibly. Hannah looked at Caleb, then at Clara. Clara looked at Caleb. He could have said something gracious and non-committal. He could have left himself an easy exit. "If it's all right," he said. "Yes." He rode back to the Whitmore Ranch in the dark, and the whole ride back he was turning things over in his mind. The papers, the survey, the competing claim filed in his father's name. He knew how his father operated. He'd known it for years, the way you know a thing you've stopped trying to argue with because arguing with it changes nothing. Victor Whitmore was not a cruel man by his own accounting. He was simply a man who had decided that the expansion of his holdings was a force as natural and inevitable as the seasons. Obstacles were not moral problems. They were logistical ones. Clara Bennett and her 3 younger siblings were a logistical obstacle. Caleb unsaddled Fletcher in the barn and stood in the cold for a while after, not ready to go inside. The ranch house was lit up warm and yellow through its windows. His father would be at the desk in his study, the way he spent every evening, going over ledgers and correspondence and maps. Maps of the northeastern range. Caleb stood in the barn doorway and looked at those lights for a long time. He went inside. His father was indeed at the desk. Victor Whitmore was a large man going gray at the temples, with hands that looked like they'd been built for hard work, even though they hadn't touched it in 15 years. He looked up when Caleb came in, scanning him with the quick efficiency of a man who assessed things. "You were out past dark," Victor said. "I rode north," Caleb said. "Found a homestead out past the creek boundary." His father's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A kind of attention that was quieter and more alert than what had been there before. "Is that right?" "A woman and 3 children. They've been there since '82. Their parents died last winter." Victor looked back at his ledger. "I've got lawyers handling that. I saw the papers they filed." "Then you know the situation." Caleb stood still in the middle of the room. "The survey they're using is wrong. The creek puts them clearly inside their original homestead claim." His father turned a page. "My lawyers disagree." "Your lawyers are wrong, or they're lying to you." Victor looked up. His expression was not angry, something cooler than anger, more deliberate. "Those are strong words." "It's a family, Dad," Caleb said. "A woman trying to keep 3 kids alive through a Wyoming winter. There's no mineral rights out there, no water rights worth fighting over. It's just land." "It's my land," Victor said. "It isn't," Caleb said. "That's the problem." They looked at each other across the desk. The fire in the hearth made the only sound in the room. Victor set down his pen very carefully. "You've been out there once," he said. "You don't know the full picture." "I know what the documents say." "Documents can be challenged. So can your survey." His father's jaw tightened just slightly. "This is a business matter, Caleb. It doesn't require your conscience to weigh in." Caleb stood very still. He felt something, standing there, something that had been building for a long time, some pressure behind his sternum that had never quite found its release. "There are children sleeping in a cabin where I could see my breath," he said. "It's a business matter to you. To them, it's the only home they have." Victor Whitmore picked up his pen again. "Get some sleep," he said. "We'll talk in the morning." He did not look up again. Caleb stood there for another moment, long enough that it was its own kind of statement, and then he walked out. He lay in his bed that night and stared at the ceiling and thought about Clara standing in the snow with an axe at her side, and Thomas asking if he was coming back, and the careful, exhausted look in Clara's eyes when she'd set those papers in front of him. He thought about the name on the filing. His name. His father's name. The same name. He wasn't sure yet what he was going to do. He wasn't someone who made grand decisions in the middle of the night and felt certain about them by morning. That wasn't how he was built. But he knew this. He was going back to that cabin, and he was going to find a way to fix what had been done. He just hadn't yet figured out what that was going to cost him. He went back 3 days later. He told himself it was because of the documents, because he needed to look more carefully at the original survey notes, cross-reference the creek boundary against the competing claim his father's lawyers had filed, and figure out whether there was a legal angle worth pursuing before things escalated. That was the practical reason, the one he could defend if anyone asked. He brought flour, cornmeal, 2 tins of lard, a wrapped piece of smoked bacon, and a coil of rope he'd noticed was missing from their wall. He also brought, tucked inside his coat, a copy of the competing land claim that he'd taken from his father's desk the morning after their argument. Victor hadn't mentioned it. Neither had Caleb. They'd eaten breakfast across from each other in silence, his father reading correspondence, Caleb watching him, and somewhere between the coffee and the cold biscuits, Caleb had made a decision without quite announcing it to himself. The snow had stopped, but the cold had deepened. Fletcher moved carefully over the crusted drifts, his breath coming in long plumes. The sky was the flat white of an overcast winter afternoon, the kind that made the whole territory feel like it had been pressed under glass. He heard the axe before he saw the cabin, a steady rhythm of it, not the frantic chopping of someone trying to get warm fast, but the measured work of someone rationing their effort. He came around the cottonwoods and found Clara splitting wood in the small clearing beside the cabin, her coat open despite the temperature, her hair coming loose from its knot on one side. She had a technique that was efficient without being graceful, the kind of motion that had been built by repetition rather than instruction. She didn't stop when she heard him. "You came back," she said, setting the maul for another split. "I said I would. People say a lot of things." She split the log, set the halves aside, reached for another. "Supplies again?" "And the document." He pulled out the copy from inside his coat. "I want to look at the survey notes again. I think I know where the discrepancy is." She stopped then. She set the maul down against the block and looked at him, and then at the papers in his hand. Her expression was complicated, not quite hope, because hope was something she'd learned to keep on a short leash, but something in the neighborhood of it, held carefully at arm's length. "Come inside," she said. Eli was at the table doing sums on a piece of paper when they came in, working with the focused frown of someone who found numbers disagreeable but refused to be beaten by them. He looked up at Caleb, then at the supplies Caleb set on the counter, then back at his paper. He didn't say anything, but he didn't leave the room either, which Caleb was beginning to understand was Eli's version of a welcome. Thomas came out from behind the curtain at the back with sleep still on his face, hair sticking up on one side, carrying the same piece of frayed rope he'd had 3 days ago. He stopped when he saw Caleb and his face arranged itself into an expression of cautious pleasure. "You're back," he said. "I am," Caleb said. Thomas considered this. "Did you bring anything?" "Thomas," Claire's voice flat. "It's fine." Caleb reached into the pack and produced a small paper twist of hard candy he'd grabbed from the general store in town, somewhat on impulse, somewhat because he'd remembered the particular expression on Thomas's face when he'd been handed the jerky 3 days ago. "Here." Thomas took it with both hands and stood there holding it like it might disappear. "What do you say?" Eli said, without looking up from his sums. "Thank you," Thomas said. He looked at Caleb with the total sincerity that young children deploy before they learn that gratitude can also be performed. "I like you," he said. It was such a simple thing. Caleb didn't know exactly what to do with it, so he just nodded. Clara spread the papers on the table and they stood side by side looking at them. The original survey her father had commissioned in 1882, the homestead filing, the creek notation at the property's northeastern edge, then the competing claim, which referenced a different survey from 1880, 2 years earlier, that placed the creek's main channel 120 yards east of where the 1882 survey put it. "Here," Caleb said, setting his finger on the 1880 document. "This survey was done for a railroad easement that never got built. It was a rough measurement, not a property survey. The creek changes course up near the headwaters. It did it sometime between 1879 and 1882, which is why the measurements are different." He looked at her. "Your father's survey was done after the shift. It's accurate. The 1880 document is measuring a channel that doesn't exist anymore." Clara was quiet for a moment, looking at the papers. He could see her working through it. "Can you prove that?" she said. "I think so. There's a man in Cheyenne, a surveyor named Aldous Marsh. He does government work. He'd know the history of that creek section." He paused. "The problem is getting him to look at it and paying for his time." She pressed her lips together. "How much?" "I don't know yet, but that's something I can find out." She turned and looked at him, direct, the way she did everything. "Why are you doing this?" He'd expected the question. He'd thought about how to answer it honestly without it sounding like performance. "Because the claim against you is built on a document that doesn't mean what my father's lawyers are saying it means, and I know that, and you'd lose if it went to a court that didn't know it." "That's the practical reason," she said. "What's the other one?" He looked at her for a moment. "I don't like the way my father does business," he said. "I never have. I've just never had a specific reason to do anything about it before." She held his eyes for a long beat. Then she looked back at the papers. "How long would this take, getting the surveyor?" "A few weeks, maybe. The weather makes travel slow right now." A few weeks was a long time. He could see her calculating what that meant. Food, firewood, the children, the roof that was sagging at one corner, the wall that wasn't keeping the wind out the way it should. A few weeks in January in Wyoming was not an abstraction. "I can help with the practical things in the meantime," he said, "if that's acceptable." She was quiet for a moment. He'd noticed that about her. She didn't fill silences the way some people did, nervously or reflexively. She let them sit until she knew what she wanted to put in them. "The roof needs work," she said finally. "I haven't been able to get up there alone, and I can't leave the children long enough to do it safely. The left corner, one more heavy snowfall, and it comes down." "I can look at it." "Not today. The light's already going." "Then tomorrow." She nodded. One short, decided nod, the kind that closed the matter. So he came back the next morning with tools and additional timber, and he and Eli, who had appointed himself assistant without being asked, in the manner of a boy who needed to believe he was contributing, spent most of the morning reinforcing the roof from the inside, wedging new supports under the sagging beam, replacing the boards that had rotted through. It was cold, cramped work. Caleb cracked his head on a rafter twice and managed, once, to drop a handful of nails that scattered across the floor below, and sent Thomas scrambling to collect them with the intense focus of a child who has been given an important job. Eli handed things up when asked, and asked questions the whole time. Not conversational questions, but technical ones. How do you know which boards to replace? How do you tell if a beam's compromised all the way through or just at the surface? What's the right angle for a brace? Caleb answered each one as straight as he could. Eli listened without comment, absorbed the answers, and asked the next question. He never said thank you. He never smiled. But at one point, when Caleb was trying to hold a board in place and drive a nail at the same time and failing at both simultaneously, Eli reached up without being asked and held the board steady. He held it exactly right, with exactly the right amount of pressure, until the nail was set. "Thanks," Caleb said. Eli shrugged and climbed back down. By noon, the roof was substantially more sound. Not perfect. Nothing about the cabin was perfect. But it would hold through the rest of the season. Clara made coffee from the tin Caleb had brought, and they sat at the table, the children eating cornbread, and it was the most normal thing in the world, and also somehow not normal at all. "My father built this place wrong," Clara said, looking up at the repaired corner. She didn't say it bitterly, just factually. He was a school teacher. He knew books. He didn't know lumber. "He built it," Caleb said. "That's not nothing." "It leans," she said. "Most things do, eventually." She looked at him with the particular expression of someone who is deciding whether something is meant to be funny. He wasn't entirely sure himself. "He would have figured it out," Eli said, quietly, from the other end of the table. "He was getting better at it. He fixed the north wall himself, the fall before he got sick. Did it right." Nobody said anything for a moment. Thomas was looking at his cornbread with sudden concentration. "He sounds like someone who didn't give up on things," Caleb said. Eli looked at him. Something in the boy's expression shifted. Not softening exactly, but the edge of it changed. "He wasn't a quitter," Eli said. "Neither are you," Caleb said. Eli looked away. He picked up his cornbread and ate it and didn't say anything else. But the set of his shoulders was different after that. Something released in them that had been held very tight. He came back the day after, and then the day after that. There was always something practical to account for it. The wall section that needed the feed sacking replaced with real timber, the door that needed its hinges reset so it hung straight and kept the draft out, the firewood that needed to be built up before the next storm came through. And there was always the document work, the careful cataloging of the survey notes, the letter Caleb drafted to Aldous Marsh in Cheyenne asking for a professional assessment of the competing creek surveys. But the practical reasons began to feel, after the first week, like scaffolding around something else. He noticed things. The way Clara organized the cabin with an efficiency that was almost military. Everything in a specific place, nothing wasted. The way she kept the children's routines intact even when things were hard, as if the predictability of breakfast at the same time, lessons at the same hour, bedtime at the same moment, was itself a form of shelter. The way she read to them at night from the 2 books they owned, doing different voices for different characters, without apparently caring whether it was dignified, making Hannah laugh, and Thomas go very still with the particular stillness of a child being taken somewhere. He noticed the way she never asked for more than she'd already allowed herself to ask for. If he brought something she hadn't mentioned needing, she would look at it for a moment and then put it away without comment. Not ungratefully. There was always a nod, a brief meeting of eyes, but without the performance of gratitude that would have made him feel like he was being thanked at a safe distance. What she gave him instead was the work itself. If he was there, he was useful. That was the arrangement. She didn't treat him like a guest or like a benefactor. She handed him a hammer and pointed at a problem and trusted him to sort it out. He wasn't sure the last time anyone had trusted him to sort something out. One afternoon, about 10 days in, he was replacing a section of chinking between the cabin logs when she came out and stood nearby, watching. She had her arms crossed against the cold, and her breath was fogging, and she watched him work with that considering expression she had. "You're not bad at this," she said. "I'm mediocre at this," he said. "But I'm improving. You've done ranch work before." "I grew up on a ranch, but mostly I managed other people doing the work." He pressed a handful of the clay and straw mixture into the gap and worked it flat. "It's different, doing it yourself." "Better or worse?" He thought about it. "Better," he said. "Worse on the back. Better on everything else." She made a small sound that might have been agreement. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask." "When I first rode up, you let me in because the children needed to eat. I understand that. But you knew my name. You knew who my father was." He looked at her. "That was a risk." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "So, how did you decide?" She looked out at the tree line before she answered, like the answer was somewhere in the bare cottonwoods. "You came alone," she said. "And you didn't come to the door. You stopped at a distance and you waited." She paused. "Your father's men don't wait. They ride up to the door and they knock like they already own the place." She looked back at him. "You weren't sure you had the right to be there. I could see it." He absorbed that. And that was enough. That and the fact that Thomas hadn't eaten since the morning before. She said it without self-pity, just the flat acknowledgement of circumstances. Sometimes the calculus is simple. He turned back to the chinking. He pressed another section flat and smoothed it. "I haven't told my father I'm coming here," he said. "I know." "When he finds out, I know," she said again. "That's your problem to reckon with, not mine." He looked at her. She met his eyes with a steadiness that was not unkindness. "I wasn't asking for help with it," he said. "Good," she said, "because I don't have any to spare." But there was something in the way she said it, very slight, barely there, that was different from the distance she'd maintained the first few days. Something that acknowledged they were in the same wind, even if they'd arrived there by different paths. The letter from Aldous Marsh came back 14 days after Caleb had sent it. He read it at the kitchen table in the ranch house before his father came down for breakfast, folded it carefully, and put it inside his coat. Marsh was willing to review the surveys. His fee was $40, plus travel expenses from Cheyenne. He could make the trip in late February if the weather held. $40. Caleb had it. The problem was that drawing on his own funds in a way that left any kind of paper trail, any record his father's accountant might see, was the kind of thing that would end the quiet phase of all this and start a different phase. His father was not a man who missed things in his ledgers. He rode out to the cabin that afternoon. Clara read the letter twice. She handed it back to him. $40, she said. I can handle the money, he said. That's not the issue. It's an issue to me, she said. Clara, don't. She said it quietly, but with a firmness that stopped him completely. I understand that you can afford it, and I can't. I understand the practical argument, but if you pay that money without any arrangement between us, then I am in debt to a Whitmore, and I don't intend to be in debt to a Whitmore. He opened his mouth. He closed it. She had a point. She had a precise and unsentimental point, and she delivered it without any drama, and she was right. What kind of arrangement, he said. Work, she said. Whatever you need done. Within reason. He thought about it. He thought about the ranch house roof, which his father kept saying needed to be looked at before spring. He thought about the north pasture fence line, which required 4 or 5 days of repair work that nobody had gotten to yet. I thought about the fact that Clara was probably stronger and more competent than 3/4 of the hands his father employed. There's a fence line, he said. When the weather breaks. When the weather breaks, he agreed. She nodded. It was settled. He noticed Eli at the table look between them and then go back to his reading with the carefully calibrated nonchalance of a boy who was paying close attention and preferred you didn't notice. February came in gray and bitter and then broke unexpectedly warm for a week. Not warm by any city measure, but warm enough for the fence work. Clara came out 3 mornings in a row, leaving Hannah in charge of the younger ones, and worked the north pasture line with Caleb and 2 of the regular hands, neither of whom knew quite what to make of her. The first morning she didn't say much to anyone and just worked. By the end of the first day, one of the hands, a quiet man named Dorch, who'd worked the Whitmore ranch for 4 years, had taken to handing her the wire without being asked, simply because she consistently positioned herself where the wire needed to go. The second morning, Dorch said, "You done fence work before?" "Plenty," Clara said. He nodded and didn't ask anything else. And after that, they worked easily together, the 3 of them, while Caleb handled the posts and felt, for perhaps the first time in years, that he was in a place where nobody was positioning themselves for anything. The second evening, riding back toward the cabin, Clara said, "Your men are decent." "Most of them are," Caleb said. "They do what they're told, same as anyone." "Same as anyone," she repeated. He understood what she meant. The same men, given different orders, would have done different things. "Yeah," he said. They rode for a while in a quiet that had stopped being uncomfortable somewhere around the end of the first week, the kind of quiet that settles between people who have been in the same wind long enough. "Hannah's been asking about you," Clara said. She said it like it was a piece of information with no particular angle on it. "What kind of asking?" "She wanted to know if you had a wife." Clara did not look at him when she said this. Her eyes were on the trail ahead. He thought about that for a moment. "What did you tell her?" "That I didn't know, and it wasn't our business." She paused. "She said that if you didn't have one, you seemed like you'd be a good one to have." Another pause, shorter. "A good husband, not a wife." That's what she meant. "I understood," he said. "She's 10, Clara said. "Her opinions about marriage are not highly developed." "Still a compliment," he said. She made the sound that might have been amusement. He was becoming more confident in his read of that particular sound. "Do you?" he said. "No. Have an opinion about—" He stopped. "That's a bad question." "It is," she said pleasantly. He let it go. They rode the rest of the way in that quiet, the land going purple-gray in the late afternoon, Fletcher and Clara's horse moving at the same easy pace. What he didn't say, and what he thought about later lying in his bunk staring at the ceiling, was that somewhere in the last month he'd stopped coming to the cabin because of the documents. He'd known it for a while. He just hadn't said it to himself in so many words yet. On the last day of February, Caleb came home from the cabin later than usual and found his father in the front room, not in the study. Victor was standing by the window with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched, and when Caleb came through the door, his father turned and looked at him with an expression Caleb had seen before. Not anger, which would have been almost easier. Something quieter and colder. "Dorch mentioned you've had him out at the north fence line," Victor said. "It needed doing," Caleb said. He didn't take his coat off. "You said yourself it had to be handled before spring." "He mentioned there was a woman helping." Victor's voice was very even. A woman from out toward the creek. Caleb stood still. He didn't know who she was, Victor continued, but I had a fair guess. He finally turned away from the window and set his glass on the mantel. Tell me I'm wrong. You're not wrong, Caleb said. The room held a silence that had texture to it. How long? Victor said. About 6 weeks. His father looked at him, not with the specific anger of a man who's been disobeyed, with something that was possibly worse, the particular disappointment of a man who thought he knew someone and has discovered he was mistaken. I have lawyers handling this, Caleb. Your lawyers are building their case on a survey that won't hold up, Caleb said. I've written to a surveyor in Cheyenne. He's agreed to review both documents. When he does, and when he confirms that the 1880 survey is measuring a creek channel that moved before the Bennetts ever filed their claim, this whole thing falls apart anyway. The question is whether it falls apart in court after you've spent money on it, or falls apart now before anyone's wasted anything. His father was quiet for a moment. You've written to a surveyor. Yes. Using what money? My own, Caleb said. It's mine to use. Victor looked at him for a long time. Then he walked to his desk and sat down and picked up the pen he seemed to use as a prop for thinking and turned it over in his hand. She's put you up to this, he said. She hasn't put me up to anything, Caleb said. She didn't ask me to come out there. I found them by accident, and I looked at the documents, and the documents are wrong. This is not complicated, Dad. Everything is complicated, Victor said. You're 26 years old, and you're making decisions about my business based on 6 weeks of, what? Neighborly feeling? The woman has 3 children and nowhere else to go, and you feel bad about it. And now I'm doing what's right, Caleb said. The word hung between them. Victor looked at it like he was evaluating a piece of machinery for flaws. What's right? He said slowly. According to who? According to the survey records, the land office filings, and any judge in the territory who looks at the actual documents. Caleb took a breath. According to me. Victor set the pen down. He looked at his son for a long time with an expression that was evaluating something, calculating something, measuring some distance. You've already decided, he said. It wasn't a question. I've already decided, Caleb said. His father nodded once, the kind of nod that concludes something rather than agreeing with it. Then we'll see how this plays out, he said. He picked up his whiskey. Get some sleep. Caleb went to his room and sat on the edge of his bed in the dark. His heart was going faster than he'd have liked. He pressed his hands together and looked at the floor. He'd told his father the truth. He told it plainly and without flinching, which was something he'd spent most of his life not doing. It had not fixed anything. His father had not suddenly seen reason. The legal machinery was still in place, the claims still filed, the lawyers still retained. Nothing had shifted in any structural way. But something had shifted in Caleb. He wasn't entirely sure yet what it was going to ask of him. He sat in the dark and thought about Clara standing in the snow with an axe at her side, Thomas holding candy in both hands, Eli's hand steadying a board without being asked. He thought about the quiet at the end of the day riding back from the fence line, the land going purple in the late light. He thought about the way Clara had said, "That's your problem to reckon with, not mine." He thought that she was right, and he thought that he was only beginning to understand the shape of it. Aldous Marsh arrived on a Thursday in the 3rd week of February, which was earlier than expected and later than Caleb had hoped. He was a small man, narrow through the shoulders, with a precise white beard and the careful movements of someone who had spent decades reading terrain that most people walked across without thinking. He came by stage to the nearest town, Delridge, and Caleb met him there and brought him out by wagon, which took the better part of a morning over roads that were more suggestion than fact in the late winter mud. Marsh did not talk much on the ride. He looked at the land with professional attention, occasionally noting something in a small leather journal he kept in his breast pocket. When they reached the creek that formed the northeastern boundary of the Bennett claim, he climbed down from the wagon without being asked and walked the bank for 20 minutes in near silence, occasionally crouching to examine something in the soil or the vegetation, making his notations. Caleb waited. He'd learned in the past several weeks that waiting was sometimes the most useful thing available to him. Clara was at the cabin when they arrived. She had been expecting them. Caleb had ridden out 2 days before to tell her when Marsh would come, and she had the tin box of documents on the table and coffee on the fire. She greeted Marsh with the directness she gave everyone, shook his hand, offered him a chair, and set the original 1882 survey in front of him before he'd finished sitting down. Marsh looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at the copy of the 1880 railroad easement survey that Caleb had brought from his father's desk. He went back and forth between the two documents several times, occasionally holding one up to the light from the window. He asked Clara two questions: when the family had arrived, and whether she or her father had observed any change in the creek's main channel during their time on the land. She answered both questions precisely. Then Marsh went back outside and walked the creek bank again. When he came back in, he sat down and wrote in his journal for a while. The cabin was quiet except for the fire and Thomas, who was in the back room with Hannah, attempting by the sound of it to build something out of sticks that kept collapsing. "The 1882 survey is accurate," Marsh said finally. He said it the way people state things they are entirely certain of, without decoration. "The 1880 document is measuring a secondary channel that the creek occupied prior to a shift in the main flow. The shift happened, based on the vegetation patterns and the sediment along the current bank, sometime in late 1881 at the latest, possibly earlier." He closed his journal. Whoever filed the competing claim against this property either did not understand the difference between the two surveys or understood it perfectly well and filed anyway. He said the last part without editorial. Just let it sit there. Clara looked at the table. She pressed her lips together, and for a moment, just a moment, Caleb could see the weight of the last year and more sitting on her all at once. The months of carrying this thing without knowing if it could be won, and then she straightened her back and looked at Marsh. "Will you put that in writing?" she said. "That's what you're paying me for," he said. Marsh's written assessment arrived by post 12 days later, 2 pages in precise technical language that left no room for interpretation. Caleb picked it up from the post office in Delridge and read it standing in the street in the cold and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the specific satisfaction of a thing coming out right. He rode to the cabin first before going home. Clara read it at the table while the children ate. She read it once, quickly, and then went back and read it again more slowly. When she set it down, she sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at the window. "This is enough," Caleb said. "Any competent lawyer in the territory will look at this assessment and tell my father his claim doesn't hold." "Your father doesn't retain incompetent lawyers," Clara said. "No," he said. "He doesn't." She understood what that meant. So did he. A competent lawyer presented with Marsh's assessment and his father's money might find a way to complicate things anyway, to file additional claims, to delay, to find some other angle. The law was not always about truth. He'd understood that abstractly his whole life and was understanding it more concretely now. "We need our own lawyer," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. "That costs money." "I know." "Caleb." She said his name with a particular weight, not a reprimand, something closer to a warning. The warning of someone who has been watching a situation develop and can see where it's going. "You've already paid for the surveyor. You've spent 6 weeks out here. You've had 2 of your father's hands working your father's fence line with me, as though that was a normal arrangement." She paused. "At what point does your father put all of that together?" "He's already putting it together," Caleb said. "I told him I'd written to Marsh. He knows I've been coming out here." Clara went still. "You told him?" "I wasn't going to lie about it." "I didn't ask you to lie. I asked you how much of this he knows." Her voice had an edge to it that he hadn't heard before. Not anger exactly, but alarm with a structure under it. "If he knows you're helping me build a case against his claim—" "He knows," Caleb said. "Yes." The room felt different after that. Clara stood up and went to the fire and added a piece of wood, more for something to do with her hands than because the fire needed it. "Then we're not in the quiet phase anymore," she said. "No," he said. "We're probably not." She stood facing the fire for a moment. Her back was straight and her shoulders were level, but he could see the tension in them from across the room. "He's going to do something," she said. Not a question. "He's going to try to move faster than we do," Caleb said. "That's how he operates. If the legal claim is compromised, he'll find another angle. He might try to approach you directly, offer money, make it seem like the easiest option. Or he might—" He stopped. She turned around. "Say it." He might try to file additional claims, or find some technicality in your original homestead filing, or pressure the land office. He looked at her steadily. I don't know which because he hasn't told me. Of course he hasn't. She came back to the table and stood with her hands resting on the back of a chair. She looked at him with those direct, measuring eyes. You're still living in his house? Yes. While helping me fight his claim? Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. He had the feeling she was trying to work out something about him that she hadn't resolved yet. Why haven't you left? She said. It was a more complicated question than it sounded. He took a moment with it. Because if I leave his house, he knows I'm fully committed to opposing him, and he escalates immediately. While I'm there, he's still treating this as something that might be managed internally, that buys you time. And when that stops working, then it stops working, he said, and I deal with that then. She was quiet for a moment. That's not a plan, she said. No, he agreed. It isn't. She sat down. She picked up Marcia's assessment and looked at it again, not really reading it, just holding it. I want to find a lawyer, she said, before he moves. Whatever it costs, we figure it out. Work, trade, whatever arrangement makes sense. But I want someone with the actual documents in hand before your father decides he's done being patient. She looked at him. Can you find someone? Someone who isn't in your father's pocket. There's a man in Delridge, Caleb said. Edmund Ferris. He does land cases. He's not connected to my father's firm. You know him? I know of him. He has a reputation for being thorough. Is he expensive? Probably, Caleb said honestly. Clara set down the assessment. She looked at the table surface for a moment, then looked up. The fence work was enough, she said. I know that. I'm not asking for charity, but I don't have anything else to trade right now that adds up to what a lawyer costs. I have money put aside, Caleb said. My own money, not my father's operating funds. It's mine. From the years I've been working the ranch without taking the salary I was owed, because I never needed it. Caleb, let me finish. He leaned forward slightly. I'm not offering it because I feel sorry for you. I'm offering it because I have it, and you need it, and what you're trying to protect is worth protecting. Those are three separate facts. You can decide whether they add up to something you can accept. She looked at him with that expression she had, considering, careful, giving nothing away too fast. And what do you get? She said. He didn't have a clean answer for that. He'd thought about it, alone at night in the ranch house, staring at the ceiling. What did he get? Not the land. That was hers. Not a debt she owed him. He didn't want that. Not the feeling of having done something honorable, because that was too easy and too self-serving to count for much. I get to be someone I can stand, he said. That's what I get. The room was quiet except for the fire and the distant sound of Thomas's construction project in the back, finally collapsing with a crash, and then Hannah's voice saying firmly, I told you that wouldn't work. Clara looked at him for another long moment, then she nodded. One short nod, the same kind she'd given him about the roof. Then we go see Ferris, she said. They went to Delridge 3 days later, leaving the children with a neighbor woman, Mrs. Aldrich, who lived 4 miles east and who had, over the past year, become the closest thing to an ally Clara had in the territory. Mrs. Aldrich was 60, sharp, and maintained a firm opinion that Victor Whitmore had too much land and too little conscience, which she expressed plainly to anyone who asked, and several people who didn't. Edmund Ferris had an office above the feed store on Delridge's Main Street, reached by an outside staircase that was aggressively unsteady in the late winter cold. He was a large man, broad through the chest, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and a desk that was buried under papers in a way that suggested a complex but internal organizational system. He shook both their hands, looked at Clara without any of the assessment some men did, the kind that measured whether a woman's presence in a law office was appropriate, and said, Sit down, let's look at what you've got. They spread the documents on the only clear surface available, which was a low table near the window. Ferris read through everything without speaking for a long time. He read Marcia's assessment twice, making small sounds that communicated nothing definite. He asked Clara 3 questions about the original filing, all technical, all answered precisely. Then he leaned back in his chair, which expressed significant protest at the shift in weight, and looked at both of them over his glasses. The survey case is solid, he said. Marsh is credible and his assessment is clear. If this went before a judge on survey evidence alone, you'd win. He paused. The problem is that Victor Whitmore's lawyers are not going to let it go to a judge on survey evidence alone. What will they do? Clara said. They'll attack the original homestead filing on procedural grounds. They'll look for any technicality, a date discrepancy, an error in the boundary description, anything that gives them grounds to challenge the filing's validity rather than the survey. He tapped the documents. They'll also probably try to claim that the property was abandoned, given that your parents died and you've been maintaining it without additional adult support. There are cases where abandonment has been successfully argued in similar circumstances. Clara's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes hardened. I did not abandon this property. I have been there every day for a year. I know that, Ferris said. He wasn't being dismissive, so he was being direct back, which was the right way to talk to her. And we can demonstrate it. Testimony, records, witnesses who've seen you working the land. The neighbor woman, Mrs. Aldrich. Yes, her testimony would be useful. He looked at Caleb. Yours would be considerably more complicated. I know, Caleb said. You testifying against your father's claim could be challenged as conflict of interest, bias, bad faith. Ferris paused. Or it could be compelling precisely because of who you are. It depends on the judge and on how Whitmore's lawyers decide to play it. Caleb sat with that. I'm not worried about how I'll be characterized, he said. I'm worried about whether the right thing gets done. Ferris looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone reassessing. All right, he said. Then here's what I think we do. He talked for another 40 minutes. The counterfiling they needed to make, the timeline, the documentation they'd need to gather for the abandonment defense, the witnesses, the sequence of legal moves that would position Clara's claim as the stronger one by the time a judge looked at it. He spoke in the practical language of someone who understood courts not as abstractions but as mechanisms with specific levers, and he didn't talk down to Clara once. When he was done, Clara asked him what his fee would be. He told her. She didn't flinch, which Caleb suspected cost her some effort. She looked at the documents on the table. Then she looked at Caleb. He nodded. We'll have the retainer to you by the end of the week, she said. Ferris nodded. He shook their hands again. On the way to the door, he said, Miss Bennett, I should tell you, I took a land case against Victor Whitmore 4 years ago. Smaller situation, different county. We didn't win, but we came close enough that his lawyers had to work for it. He paused. I haven't had occasion to pick that particular fight again. I'd be glad to. Clara looked at him steadily. You'll get your chance, she said. On the ride back from Delridge, they didn't talk much for the first several miles. The sky had gone the color of pewter in the late afternoon, the kind of sky that couldn't decide between snow and just making everything feel heavy and gray. He's good, Clara said eventually. I thought he would be. He's not going to make this easy for us, though. He said it straight. She looked at the road ahead. There are a lot of ways this can still go wrong. Yes, Caleb said. Your father has more money and more lawyers and more time, she said. We have one lawyer, a surveyor's report, and a filing from 1882. And documentation of everything your family built on that land, he said, and witnesses, and the truth about the survey. People win with less than we have, he said. She looked at him sidelong. And lose with more. He couldn't argue that. Yes, he said, they do. She was quiet for another mile or so. The wagon moved through the late afternoon light, and the bare trees threw long shadows across the road. I keep thinking about what Ferris said, she said, about the abandonment argument. She said it evenly, but there was something under the evenness. That my parents died and I kept the place going alone, and somehow that could be used as an argument that the land was abandoned. She shook her head very slightly. I carried water when the creek froze. I cut wood until my hands bled. I kept 3 children alive through a winter with no help and no money. And the argument is that I abandoned something. Caleb didn't say anything for a moment. There wasn't much to say that didn't reduce it. The law is sometimes a terrible piece of machinery, he said finally. Yes, she said, it is, and we're about to put ourselves inside it and hope it doesn't grind us up. She said it without self-pity, which somehow made it worse. He thought about his father, back at the ranch house, and wondered what Victor was doing right now. Whether he'd already spoken to his lawyers again, whether the conversation Caleb had started in the study 2 weeks ago had set something in motion that was already further along than Caleb knew. He thought about that with a particular focused unease. He found out 4 days later. He came home from an errand in the South Pasture to find his father's lead lawyer, a man named Gerald Holt, sitting in the front room with 2 associates and a stack of papers on the table. Victor was at his desk. The atmosphere in the room had the specific density of a conversation that had been going on for some time and had arrived somewhere significant. Holt was a man in his 50s with a quality that Caleb could only describe as smoothness. Everything about him was polished. His speech, his posture, the angle at which he held himself, all of it calibrated to give the impression of effortless control. Caleb had known him for years and had never quite been able to locate anything warm in him. "Caleb," Victor said, "sit down." Caleb stayed standing. "What's happening?" Holt shuffled one of his papers. "We've been reviewing the Bennett claim in light of the surveyor's assessment you commissioned," he said. He said it without any particular inflection, as though the fact of Caleb having commissioned it was simply a piece of information in the file. "We believe there's an avenue that sidesteps the survey question entirely." Caleb looked at his father. Victor was watching him. "What avenue?" Caleb said. "The original homestead filing," Holt said. "Specifically, the witness signatures on the 1882 document. One of the 2 witnesses named on the filing, a man named Garrett, who signed as a neighbor and witness to the Bennett's occupation of the land, we've been unable to locate any evidence that he existed in the county at that time. No census records, no tax rolls, no deed records." The room was quiet. "What does that mean?" Caleb said, though he already knew. "It means the filing may have been fraudulently witnessed," Holt said, "which would render it invalid." Caleb looked at his father. "A man's signature is missing from the county records," he said slowly. "That's what you're going with." "It's a valid legal question," Holt said. "Her father was a school teacher," Caleb said. "He kept records of everything. If there's a signature on that document, the man existed." "Then he should be findable," Holt said pleasantly. "The burden of proof would be on the claimant." "She doesn't have time or money to track down a witness from 7 years ago," Caleb said. He heard his own voice tighten. "And you know that." "Caleb," his father's voice was even. "This is a delay tactic," Caleb said. "This is designed to make the case expensive and slow and complicated enough that she gives up or runs out of resources." "It's a legal filing," Holt said. "Nothing more." Caleb looked at the man for a long moment. Holt met his gaze without expression, which was somehow worse than if he'd shown something. "When?" Caleb said. "We file Monday," Victor said. Caleb turned to his father. They looked at each other across the desk. Something passed between them that didn't have words attached to it. Something about the distance between what a man says he is and what he does when the cost of being that thing goes up. "Dad," he said. He said it quietly. "This isn't—" "Go get cleaned up," Victor said. "Supper's at 6. He said it the way he'd said things when Caleb was 12 and had pushed too far. The voice that closed a door. Caleb stood in the middle of the room. Holt and the associates were looking at their papers. His father was looking at nothing in particular. He turned and walked out. He went upstairs to his room and stood at the window looking out at the dark property and felt the thing that had been building for weeks settle into something harder and cleaner, something that was more like clarity. His father was going to file on Monday. That was 4 days away. He needed to get to Ferris, and he needed to get to Clara, and he needed to do it before Monday, because once that filing went in, the timeline collapsed. He also needed to decide something he'd been putting off deciding. He stood at the window for a long time. The ranch spread out below him, dark and large, and everything he'd grown up inside of. The barn where he'd learned to ride. The fence lines he'd helped build as a boy, before his father had decided Caleb was management and not labor. The house itself, which was solid and warm and as familiar to him as his own hands. He thought about what Clara had said. At what point does your father put all of that together? Well, he'd put it together. And on Monday, he was going to move. Caleb went to the wardrobe and pulled out a bag and started putting things in it. Not everything, just what he needed. He was methodical about it, the way he was methodical about most things, not rushing, not being dramatic. Boots. Extra shirt. The papers he'd been keeping in the drawer. His own copies, the documents he'd gathered, Marcia's original letter. He went back downstairs. Victor was still at his desk. Holt and the associates had gone. Caleb stood in the doorway. His father looked up. The bag in Caleb's hand was visible. Victor looked at it. His expression didn't change in any dramatic way. Something in his eyes shifted. Something Caleb couldn't fully read. Something that might have been surprise, or might have been the absence of surprise, which was almost worse. "You're leaving," Victor said. "I'll send for the rest of my things," Caleb said. His father looked at the desk. He picked up his pen, set it down again. "You're throwing away everything," he said, "for a woman you've known 2 months." "I'm not throwing away everything," Caleb said. "I'm choosing what I keep." Victor was quiet. He looked old in that moment, which was not something Caleb had seen before in him, or perhaps had not let himself see. "If you walk out that door," Victor said, "I can't protect you from what comes next." "I know," Caleb said. He didn't say anything else. He walked out. I went to Ferris first because that was the most important thing. He pounded on the door of the man's office at 8 in the evening until a light came on upstairs, and Ferris appeared at the window with an expression of combined irritation and curiosity. When he came down and opened the door and saw Caleb's face, the irritation dropped away. "Come in," he said. Caleb told him about Holt's plan, the witness on the 1882 filing, the Monday deadline. Ferris listened without interrupting, and when Caleb finished, he was already moving toward his desk. "The witness," Ferris said. "Do you remember the name Holt used?" "Garrett," Caleb said. "No first name given." The filing will have a first name." Ferris was pulling papers. "If her father kept records of everything—" "He did," Caleb said. "She does." "Then she'll have correspondence, a receipt, something with this man's full name. If he was a legitimate witness, and I believe he was because fraudulent witnessing was not a schoolteacher's move, then he's findable. It's going to take work and it's going to take fast, but it's findable." He looked at Caleb over his glasses. "I'll need someone to ride to the land office in the morning and get a copy of the original filing before Whitmore's people have any reason to interfere with it." "I'll go," Caleb said. "You have a place to stay tonight?" He hadn't thought that far. He looked at Ferris without any particular pride available to him. "I'll put a blanket on the office floor," Ferris said. "It won't be comfortable." "That's fine," Caleb said. He slept on Ferris's office floor on a folded horse blanket and stared at the dark ceiling and thought about his father's face in that last moment. Not the words, the face, the thing in the eyes that might have been grief, or might have been stubbornness, or might have been, underneath everything, something that looked almost like recognition. He thought about Clara and the children waking up in the morning, not knowing that by Monday, if they didn't move fast enough, there would be new papers filed against them, new complications, a new front to defend. He thought about Thomas's face when he'd said, "You're back." He thought about Eli holding a board steady without being asked. He thought about Clara saying, "That's your problem to reckon with, not mine." He was reckoning with it now. He was reckoning with all of it, on a cold floor in a lawyer's office with the wind working at the window, and the thing he felt, underneath the fear of what came next, underneath the loss of everything the Whitmore name had given him, was not peace exactly, but something honest, something that had the shape of a decision he could stand behind. He would ride to the land office at first light, and then he would ride to Clara. The land office opened at 7 in the morning, and Caleb was on the step at 6:45, which meant he stood in the cold for 15 minutes, watching his breath and thinking about all the ways this could still go wrong. The clerk who unlocked the door was a young man named Peterson who recognized Caleb from previous visits and greeted him with the kind of careful neutrality that people in small official positions maintain around the sons of powerful ranchers. He pulled the original Bennett homestead filing without comment and set it on the counter. Caleb found the witness signatures at the bottom of the second page. James Robert Garrett, written in a careful hand with an address listed as Rural Rote, County of Delridge, dated April 14. He asked Peterson for a copy. Peterson made it without asking why. Caleb thanked him, folded the copy into his coat, and walked out into the cold morning street. James Robert Garrett. A name. An address, even if it was vague. Something to work with. He went back to Ferris's office, where the lawyer was already at his desk with coffee and 2 days' worth of urgency written across his face. "Full name," Caleb said. "James Robert Garrett, Rural route, Delridge County, 1782. Ferris wrote it down. That's enough to start with. Census records, tax rolls, church registries, if there are any from that period. He looked up. I'm going to need someone to go through the county records today. I have a case in chambers this afternoon I can't miss. I'll do it, Caleb said. He spent the next 4 hours in the back room of the county clerk's office going through ledgers. It was tedious and uncomfortable, and twice he reached dead ends that required backing up and starting a different direction. But he'd been raised around documentation, and he knew how to read a ledger the way some people know how to read weather. By early afternoon, he had it. A tax record from 1881 listing James R. Garrett as a property holder on a small parcel 12 miles northeast of Delridge, and below that, a record of sale from November 1883 when the parcel changed hands. Garrett had sold and left. But the record of where he'd gone was there too, logged in a transfer of tax obligation to his forwarding county, Sheridan. Sheridan was 3 days' ride northeast. Caleb took the records to Ferris. The lawyer looked at them for a long moment. He's potentially reachable, he said, but 3 days there, 3 days back, plus time to locate him. That's more time than we have before Monday's filing. So we use what we have, Caleb said. We file a counter-response to the anticipated challenge before Monday. We put Garrett's existence on record, the tax record, the sale record, the forwarding county, and we argue that the challenge is procedurally premature. Ferris looked at him. You've been reading. I've been listening to you, Caleb said. It's the same thing. Ferris almost smiled. It might slow them down. A week, maybe 2. But we still need the man himself eventually. I know, Caleb said. Can you handle the counterfiling today? If you can get me the original documents from the Bennett cabin, Ferris said. The tin box, everything in it. I need to review the full file before I put anything before the court. Caleb was already standing. I'll ride out now. He reached the cabin in the early afternoon. Clara was splitting wood again. She stopped when she saw him come around the cottonwoods, and the expression on her face cycled through several things quickly before settling into something careful and watchful. She could see, from his face and the way he was riding, that something had shifted. He told her everything standing in the cold. Holt's plan, the witness challenge, Monday's deadline, what he'd found at the county clerk's office. He told it straight, without softening any of it, because that was what she'd want and also what she deserved. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she stood very still for a moment. Then she said, "The tin box." "Yes. Ferris needs everything in it." She nodded and went inside. He followed. She went to the corner of the cabin and pulled up the floorboard and lifted out the tin box, and she set it on the table and opened it, and then she stood there looking at its contents with an expression Caleb hadn't seen on her before. Not grief, something quieter than grief. The look of someone confronting the fact that every piece of paper in front of them represents a person who is no longer there to defend what they built. Her father's handwriting was on most of the documents, careful, schoolteacher script. "He wrote everything down," she said quietly. Not to Caleb specifically, more to the room or to the habit itself. "Yes," Caleb said. She closed the box and handed it to him. He took it. He looked at her. "There's something else," he said. She waited. "I left the ranch house last night," he said. "I'm not going back." She absorbed that. Her expression didn't perform surprise, but something shifted in it. "Where are you staying?" "Ferris's office, for now. I'll find something in Delridge." She looked at him steadily. "You left because of this, because of the filing." "I left because I needed to," he said. "The timing and the filing are the same thing, but they're not the only thing." She pressed her lips together for a moment. "Caleb, your inheritance is not the conversation right now," he said. "The conversation right now is getting these documents to Ferris before dark." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she nodded. It was a different kind of nod this time. Not the decisive, practical nod that ended a question, but something more complicated, something that acknowledged what he'd done and didn't have a clean category for it yet. "Take the box," she said. He took it. At the door, Thomas appeared from behind the curtain with a stick construction in his hands that was impressively unstable. He looked at Caleb with the uncomplicated directness of a child. "Are you coming back tomorrow?" he asked. "Yes," Caleb said. Thomas nodded and went back to his construction. "Mamotim." Ferris worked through that evening and into the next morning. He was thorough in the way that meticulous people are thorough, which is to say he found 3 things in the tin box that even Caleb hadn't noticed. A letter from Garrett to Clara's father, dated June 1882, a copy of a neighbor's affidavit regarding the creek boundary that Clara's father had obtained and stored without anyone apparently knowing he had it, and a receipt from the land office signed by the county land agent at the time of the original filing, which Ferris studied for a long time with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "The land agent who signed this filing," Ferris said. "His name is on this receipt." "What about him?" Caleb said. "He retired 2 years ago. He lives in Delridge." Ferris set the receipt down. "He witnessed the filing himself. If he can testify to the legitimacy of the Garrett signature, that Garrett was present, that the filing was properly witnessed, Whitmore's challenge collapses before it gets started." "Can you reach him today?" "I'm going to find out," Ferris said. The retired land agent's name was Rufus Kane, and he lived on the east side of Delridge in a small house with a woodpile that suggested he was managing adequately without assistance. He was 71, slow on his feet, but when Ferris explained the situation and showed him the receipt with his own signature on it, something sharpened in his eyes that had nothing to do with age. "James Garrett," Kane said. "I was in his kitchen, the 3 of them around the table, Caleb sitting close to the wall." "Yes, he was there. I remember him specifically because he came in with the Bennett family, and he stood in this corner." Kane pointed at a corner of his kitchen as though it were the land office itself, the habit of a man who had spent decades in that room. "And he signed the document, and I checked the signature against his name as written, and I dated it and stamped it myself." "You'd be willing to testify to that?" Ferris said. Kane looked at Ferris over the rims of his glasses. "Victor Whitmore is trying to tell a court that a signature I witnessed is fraudulent?" He paused. "Yes, I'll testify." Ferris looked at Caleb. Caleb thought, for the first time in several days, that this might actually work. Monday came the way bad weather comes. You know it's coming, you've made what preparations you can, and it arrives anyway on its own schedule without caring about yours. Holt filed the witness challenge at the county courthouse at 9 in the morning. Ferris had their counterfiling ready by 10, and he walked it to the courthouse clerk himself. The counterfiling included the tax records Caleb had found, the letter from Garrett to Clara's father, the receipt bearing Rufus Kane's signature, and a sworn statement from Kane himself, attesting to the legitimacy of the original witnessing. The clerk accepted both filings with the careful neutrality of someone whose job required him to treat every piece of paper as equally valid regardless of who it came from, which was, at least in this moment, exactly the right quality for a clerk to have. The hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday before Judge Aldrich Penway, who was not related to Mrs. Aldrich, and who had a reputation in the territory for being impatient with legal maneuvering that wasted his time. 4 days. Caleb told Clara on Tuesday when he rode out to the cabin. She listened, standing in the doorway, and when he finished she said, 4 days. 4 days, he said. She stepped back and let him in. The cabin felt different with Caleb no longer coming from the direction of the Whitmore ranch. He couldn't have explained exactly how, except that there was a shift in the air between them that was slightly less cautious than it had been. Like a door that had been ajar for weeks had moved another inch without anyone touching it. Eli was doing his sums. Hannah was mending something. Thomas was asleep on his blanket in the afternoon light, the frayed rope tucked under one arm like a stuffed animal. Clara put coffee on and sat across from Caleb at the table and said, "Tell me what Thursday looks like." He told her what Ferris had explained. The hearing wasn't a full trial. It was a preliminary proceeding to determine whether the witness challenge had sufficient grounds to proceed. Holt would present the argument that Garrett's signature was unverifiable. Ferris would present Kane, the documentary evidence, and the counterargument. Judge Penway would decide whether the challenge moved forward or was dismissed. "If it's dismissed," she said, "then the original survey case is back to the front, which is the case we'd win. And if it's not dismissed," he was quiet for a moment, "then we go to a full hearing on the witness question, and in the meantime the survey case is delayed and Ferris estimates—" He stopped. "Tell me," she said. 3 to 6 months of delay, maybe longer, during which the claim against your land is still active." She looked at the table. She was very still in the way she got when she was working through something rather than reacting to it. "And the money," she said. "A full hearing." "Yes," he said. "It would cost more." She pressed her palms flat on the table. He could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. Not panic, but the close and practiced arithmetic of someone who had been doing that math for over a year. How much was left? How long it would last? What could be cut and what couldn't? "I have some stock I can sell," she said. "The two older horses. We don't need both of them." "Clarice, that's not a tragedy, Caleb. That's a decision." She looked at him. "We don't know yet what Thursday brings. One thing at a time." He nodded. One thing at a time he was coming to understand, her fundamental philosophy. Not optimism. She was not a naturally optimistic person, or if she was, the last year had filed that down to something more durable. Pragmatism. Deal with the present thing. The next thing would come when it came. He could learn something from that. He thought he already was. Mrs. Aldrich came the day before the hearing, which Caleb had not expected. She arrived in her wagon with a covered pot of something that smelled like rabbit stew and a manner that suggested she had decided this was her business, and anyone who disagreed could manage that disagreement on their own time. She was 60 years old, broad-shouldered, with gray hair pulled back so severely it seemed to be doing structural work. She shook Caleb's hand when Clara introduced them, looked at him with the appraising frankness of someone who had been taking the measure of men for decades and had developed efficient methods. "You're Victor's boy," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You don't look like him." "I'll take that," he said. Something twitched at the corner of her mouth. She turned to Clara and set the pot on the table and said, "You need to sleep tonight. Whatever you're sitting up worrying about, it'll be there in the morning, and you'll be better equipped for it if you've slept." "I know," Clara said. "You don't," Mrs. Aldrich said pleasantly. "But you will. Sit down. Eat something." They ate. All of them. Clara, the children, Caleb, Mrs. Aldrich, around the table in the small cabin, and Mrs. Aldrich told a story about a land dispute she'd witnessed in Kansas 20 years earlier that ended with the claimant losing and then winning on appeal and then losing again on a technicality before eventually being settled by the two parties in question, meeting in a field and coming to an agreement that had nothing to do with what the court had decided. "The moral," Mrs. Aldrich said, serving herself a second portion without any apparent concern for whether she'd been offered one, "is that courts decide things and people live with them, and sometimes those are the same thing and sometimes they aren't." Eli looked up from his bowl. "What does that mean?" "It means the law is not the last word on anything," Mrs. Aldrich said. "The last word is what you decide to do after the law has had its say." Eli thought about this for a moment. "So even if they lose Thursday—" "I didn't say that," Mrs. Aldrich said. "I said the law isn't the last word. I didn't say lose first." Hannah laughed. It was a sudden, surprised laugh, the kind that comes out before the person decides to let it. Thomas looked around to see what was funny, and then laughed too, though he hadn't heard the exchange clearly enough to understand it, which was fine, because his laugh made Hannah laugh harder, and Clara sat at the end of the table with something on her face that Caleb had not seen before. Not the controlled, practical expression she carried through most things, but something more tired and more open, the face of a person letting their guard down by a degree in the presence of people they trusted. Caleb sat at the opposite end of the table and watched this and felt, with a clarity that was startling in its simplicity, that he would do whatever it took to make sure they kept this. Not the cabin, specifically. Not the land, abstractly. This, the rabbit stew, the children's laughter, the fire. Clara's face in an unguarded moment. Whatever it was that these people had built out of almost nothing and loss and stubbornness. He would not let his father's lawyers reduce it to a line item in a land acquisition. He ate his supper and didn't say anything about it, but he knew. Thursday arrived cold and gray, which felt appropriate. They rode to the Delridge courthouse in Ferris's wagon, Clara beside Ferris on the bench and Caleb in the bed with the document case. Mrs. Aldrich had come to stay with the children, which had involved a brief negotiation with Eli about whether he was old enough to accompany them that Eli had lost on the grounds that someone responsible needed to stay with Thomas, a logic he couldn't counter without insulting Thomas, who was present and listening. The courthouse was a square stone building that managed to look both solid and slightly temporary, the way frontier institutional buildings often did, as though they'd been built with one eye on the possibility that the whole enterprise might move on. The courtroom inside was plain: benches, a raised platform for the judge's desk, a rail dividing the participants from the observers, and two tables arranged opposite each other in front of the rail. Holt was already there. He was at the left table with two associates, and his papers were arranged with the precise neatness of someone who had done this many times in many courtrooms. He looked at Clara when she came in with the specific absence of expression that said he'd noted her and was unimpressed. Clara looked back at him without any expression at all. Rufus Kane was already seated in the gallery, wearing a coat that was too formal for his frame and holding his hat in his hands. He nodded at Clara when she came in. She nodded back. Caleb sat in the gallery behind the rail. He was not a party to the case. This was Clara's filing, Clara's claim. And his presence was that of a witness and an interested party, nothing more. He sat on the hard bench and put his hands on his knees and waited. Judge Penway came in without ceremony. He was a compact man in his 60s with a close-clipped gray beard and the manner of someone who had decided many years ago that impatience was an appropriate response to his workload. He sat, arranged his papers, put on his glasses, and looked over them at both tables. "This is a preliminary hearing on a challenge to the witnessed execution of a homestead filing," he said. He said it the way someone reads from a list, not dramatically, just getting it established. "The challenge is filed by Whitmore Properties. The counter is filed by Clara Bennett." He looked at Holt. "Counselor." Holt rose and presented the challenge smoothly and efficiently. He was good at this. Caleb had to admit it. The language precise, the argument logical on its face. The witness's name appeared in no verifiable county records for the period in question. The signature could not be confirmed. Without a confirmed witness, the filing's validity was in question. Simple. Clean. Then Ferris rose. He was a different kind of lawyer than Holt. Where Holt was polished and frictionless, Ferris had texture. He spoke like a man who believed what he was saying, which created a different quality of attention in the room. He began with the tax record. He walked through it line by line, establishing Garrett's existence in the county in 1882 with the patience of someone building a house one board at a time. Then the letter in Garrett's hand, written to Daniel Bennett 4 weeks after the filing. Then the land sale record from 1883. And then he called Rufus Kane. Kane walked to the front of the courtroom with the deliberate pace of a man who was going to take the time he needed, and nobody was going to rush him about it. He sat in the chair Penway indicated and arranged himself with a certain dignity. Ferris took him through it carefully. Kane confirmed the filing date, confirmed Garrett's presence, described the room, the procedure, the signature. He spoke without drama, in the plain, detailed language of someone recounting a thing they had seen. Holt cross-examined. He was careful about it, pressing on memory, on the passage of time, on whether Kane could be certain after 7 years. Kane answered each question directly and without irritation. "I stamped the document myself," Kane said at one point, when Holt pushed the question of certainty for the third time. "I dated it. I recorded it in the day's log, which I kept meticulously because it was my job. I am telling you that James Garrett was present because I watched him sign his name with my own eyes. 7 years does not change what I saw." Holt paused. He looked at his notes. He asked one more question and then said, "No further questions," in the tone of someone moving away from an unfavorable position. Penway looked at the documents Ferris had entered into evidence. He looked at Holt. He looked at Kane, still sitting patiently in his chair. "The challenge is dismissed," he said. He said it without decoration. Just the decision, and then the scratch of his pen on the order, and then he was already looking at his next case. Caleb let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. At the table, Clara sat with her hands in her lap, and her back straight, and her face still and controlled, and only someone watching closely would have seen the small, involuntary closing of her eyes that lasted exactly 1 second. Outside the courthouse, in the cold afternoon, Ferris explained what came next. The survey case was now the primary matter. The hearing on that would be scheduled in the coming weeks. Penway's calendar was heavy, but the dismissal today would clear the path. Marcia's assessment would be the centerpiece. Kane's appearance today had demonstrated the quality of their evidence. Ferris was, in his measured way, cautiously positive. Holt came out of this courthouse behind them. He paused at the top of the steps. He looked at Clara briefly, then at Caleb, with an expression that was professionally neutral but contained, somewhere beneath the polish, a quality that was not quite resentment and not quite respect, somewhere uncomfortable between the two. He left without speaking. Clara watched him go. "He'll tell your father today," she said. "Yes," Caleb said. "And your father will decide something," Caleb said. "I don't know what yet." She looked at the street. Two settlers from a neighboring parcel were standing near the feed store, watching the courthouse with the attention of people who had their own reasons to care how land cases went in this county. Caleb recognized one of them, a man named Trout, who had a small operation northeast of Del Ridge and who had been in a quiet dispute with Victor Whitmore over water access for 2 years. "Word is going to spread," Caleb said quietly. "It already is," Ferris said. He was watching the same two men. "I've had 3 people ask me about this case in the past week. People out here are watching." Clara looked at the settlers. She looked at Ferris, then she looked at Caleb. "Good," she said. 2 weeks passed in the strange, suspended state of waiting for the survey hearing to be scheduled. Caleb was renting a room above the hardware store in Del Ridge, a single room with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the main street, and he was doing what work he could find, helping with a barn raising east of town, some repair work for a widow named Marsh, who had no relation to the surveyor, odd jobs that kept him useful and occupied and also kept him thinking about practical problems rather than the larger one that still hadn't resolved. He rode out to the cabin as often as the weather and the distance allowed. He told himself this was about the case, about keeping Clara informed of developments, about the work that still needed doing on the property. Those things were true. They were not the complete truth, and he was becoming more honest with himself about that. The thing between them had not been named. He didn't think it needed to be named yet. What it was, concretely, was this. When he was at the cabin, the day had a different quality than when he wasn't. It wasn't that things were easier there. There was always something going wrong, something breaking, some disagreement between the children, some complication to manage. It wasn't ease. It was more like relevance. The feeling that what he was doing mattered to something he cared about. He hadn't had that at the ranch house. He'd had comfort and familiarity and the slow, steady feeling of wasting something. One afternoon, about 10 days before the survey hearing, he arrived at the cabin to find Clara on the roof. He stopped Fletcher and looked up at her. She was checking the chimney where the flashing had been giving trouble, moving across the shingles with the careful, balanced movement of someone who had learned to be precise about where she put her feet. "You need a ladder that reaches," he said. "I have a ladder that reaches," she said from above. "It's under my feet." "You need someone holding it." "I need the flashing fixed," she said. "Hand me the tin snips from the pack on the step." He climbed down, got the tin snips, climbed up the ladder, which did reach, barely, and handed them to her. She worked the flashing while he held the ladder. It took 20 minutes. When she climbed down, she was carrying a piece of bent metal that she'd pulled out and replaced, and her hands were cold, and there was a smear of something on her jaw. She noticed him looking at the smear. "Don't," she said. "I wasn't going to say anything," he said. "You were thinking it." "I was thinking you have good instincts on the ladder." She looked at him. "That's a strange thing to notice." "I notice things," he said. She wiped her jaw with the back of her hand, which didn't entirely fix the problem, but addressed it in a general direction. She looked at the repaired flashing in her hand. "It'll hold now," she said. "Through the spring, at least. And then? And then I'll fix it again." She said it without drama, just the fact of the ongoing maintenance of a thing you've decided to keep. He thought about that. The ongoing maintenance of a thing you've decided to keep. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. He hadn't planned what he was going to say, which was unusual for him. He was generally a person who planned things. But standing in the mud beside the cabin in the thin afternoon light with the tin snips between them, the planning mechanism seemed to have gone elsewhere. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I want you to know that. Whatever Thursday brings, whatever the case does, this isn't temporary for me." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the flashing in her hand and then at him. "I know," she said. "I wanted to say it out loud." "I know that too." She was looking at him with that direct, careful expression, the one that gave nothing away too fast but wasn't unkind. I'm not in the habit of depending on people," she said. That's not a criticism of you. It's a fact about me. It takes me time. I'm not asking for anything right now, he said. I just wanted to say it. She looked at him for another moment. Then she handed him the bent piece of flashing and said, "There's a nail in the wall of the barn it'll fit on," and walked back toward the cabin. He stood there holding the piece of metal and felt something warm and slightly ridiculous in his chest. He went and hung the metal on the nail she'd mentioned. He came back and helped her with the afternoon work. At the end of the day, when he was saddling Fletcher to ride back to Delridge, Thomas came out of the cabin and stood in the doorway watching him with the contemplative expression of a 6-year-old working through something large. "Caleb," he said. "Yeah." "Are you our family now?" The question landed with the particular weight that only children's direct questions carry, the weight of something everyone has been thinking about but not saying. Caleb finished the buckle on the saddle. He turned and looked at Thomas in the doorway. "I'm working on it," he said. Thomas seemed to find this satisfactory. He nodded and went back inside. The survey hearing was scheduled for a Thursday, which seemed to be the day that significant things happened in Delridge. Caleb thought it might have something to do with Judge Penway's calendar rather than any particular alignment of the universe, but the repetition felt meaningful anyway. The night before, Caleb sat in his room above the hardware store and wrote a letter to his father. He wasn't sure, writing it, what he was trying to accomplish. Not reconciliation. The word felt wrong, too easy, like something that resolved without earning itself. Not accusation either, though there was plenty he could have said about the competing claim and the tactics that had followed it. What he wrote, in the end, was simpler than either of those things. He wrote, "I think you built something real here, and I think you forgot, somewhere along the way, that other people were trying to do the same thing. I don't know if that's something you can hear right now, but I wanted to say it because I'm your son, and I still am, even now." He sealed the letter and put it on the small table by the window and didn't decide until morning whether to send it. In the morning, he sent it. Then he rode to the cabin, and he and Clara and Ferris rode together to the courthouse, and they sat at the table before Judge Penway, and Holt was there again with his smooth manner and his stacked papers, and Aldous Marsh sat in the gallery with his leather journal, and Rufus Kane was there again in his too formal coat, and Mrs. Aldrich was in the back row of the gallery with her arms crossed, and her expression communicating that she expected things to go correctly and would be displeased if they did not. And beside her, taking up most of one bench, were the 2 settlers from the feed store, and 3 other people Caleb didn't recognize, and a woman who farmed a small parcel to the west and who had nodded at Clara when they came in, a nod that contained more solidarity than most speeches. The courtroom was more full than any of them had expected. Clara noticed. She sat at the table and she looked at the gallery, just briefly, and something moved across her face that she controlled quickly. But Caleb saw it. He looked at the room, at the people who had come to watch, at the fact of their being there. Word had spread. Ferris had said it would. Judge Penway came in and the room went quiet and the work began, and Caleb sat behind the rail with his hands on his knees and thought about the letter he'd sent his father, and the piece of bent flashing hanging on a nail in the barn, and Thomas in the doorway asking if he was family now. He thought about all of it while Ferris stood and began speaking, and the words of the case filled the room, and outside the courthouse the Wyoming sky was the cold, enormous blue of a winter finally deciding to become spring. Ferris spoke for 40 minutes. He was methodical about it in the way that good lawyers are methodical. Not showy, not performing for the gallery, just building the case the way a careful man builds a wall, one stone set firmly before the next one goes on top. He walked Judge Penway through the creek survey evidence first. Marsh's assessment, the comparison between the 1880 railroad easement document and the 1882 property survey, the vegetation and sediment evidence that dated the creek's channel shift to before the Bennett family ever filed their claim. He spoke in plain language, translating the technical into the human without losing the precision. Then he put Marsh on the stand. Marsh was a good witness in the same way he was a good surveyor. Exact, unhurried, and utterly indifferent to whether his testimony was convenient for anyone. He answered Holt's cross-examination with the patience of a man who has spent his career being questioned by people who understand the subject less than he does and has made a kind of peace with that fact. When Holt pressed him on whether the creek channel shift could have occurred after 1882 rather than before, Marsh looked at him over his glasses and said, The sediment layering does not leave room for that interpretation. I understand that's inconvenient, but it's what the ground says. Penway wrote something on his pad. Holt regrouped and moved to his secondary argument, which was a procedural challenge to the original homestead claim's boundary description. The language in the 1882 filing, he argued, was ambiguous on the northeastern corner. It referenced a cottonwood stand rather than a surveyed point, which introduced uncertainty into the exact boundary. Ferris was ready for that too. He introduced the affidavit that Clara's father had obtained from a neighboring settler in 1883, the document that had been sitting quietly in the tin box for years, that nobody had known was there until Ferris found it, which described the cottonwood stand in enough physical detail to establish the corner with reasonable certainty. He also introduced a statement from Dortch, the ranch hand who had worked the Whitmore fence line and who had, on his own initiative, told Ferris that the boundary markers his crew had placed in the fall put the creek clearly on the Bennett side. Dortch had not been asked to do that. He had come to Ferris's office 3 days before the hearing, hat in his hands, and said he reckoned someone ought to know what he'd seen. Caleb had not known about that until Ferris told him the morning of the hearing. He sat in the gallery thinking about Dortch, who was a quiet man who did what he was told and had, at some point in the past months, decided that what he'd been told and what he knew to be right were different things, and that the difference mattered. Holt gave his closing argument with the smooth efficiency of someone who knows they're arguing uphill but has been paid to make the climb look dignified. He raised every point he could. He questioned the surveyor's methodology, the age of the affidavit, the subjectivity of boundary descriptions. He was thorough. He was professional. He was, in the way of a man who has built a career on winning through complexity rather than clarity, very good at making a straightforward thing sound uncertain. Then Ferris stood and said 9 words. The creek is where it is. It always has been. He sat down. Penway looked at his notes. He looked at the 2 stacks of documents that had been entered into evidence. He looked at both tables with the flat, considering attention of a man who had been doing this long enough to know that most cases, when you stripped away the legal language and the procedural scaffolding, came down to a question simple enough to be stated in a single sentence. He picked up his pen. The room was very quiet. The survey evidence is unambiguous, Penway said. He said it without preamble, without the warm-up language that some judges used. Just the finding, stated plainly, the way you'd state a fact about the weather. The 1880 railroad easement document measures a channel that ceased to be the creek's primary flow before the Bennett homestead claim was filed. The 1882 survey is accurate. The competing claim filed by Whitmore Properties relies on an invalid comparison and is therefore without merit. He signed the order. Judgment for the claimant. The Bennett homestead claim stands. He moved to the next matter on his desk. That was it. No speech. No dramatic pause. The weight of what had just happened was entirely in the room's response to it, which was a short, sharp exhale from the gallery. Not a cheer, but the collective release of people who had been holding something for a long time. Clara sat at the table with her hands folded and her back straight, and she did not move for a moment. Then she turned to Ferris and said, "Is that final?" "Subject to appeal," Ferris said. "But Whitmore would need grounds, and he doesn't have them." She nodded. She stood. She shook Ferris's hand with a firmness that was also, somehow, everything she wasn't going to say out loud. Caleb was already moving through the gate in the rail. She turned and he was there, and she looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen before on her face. Not the careful, controlled expression she wore through most things. Not the practical efficiency of someone managing a problem, but something stripped of all of that. Something that was just her, tired and relieved and real. She didn't say anything. She put her hand on his arm, just for a moment, just briefly. Then she let go and turned to the gallery because Mrs. Aldrich was already on her feet and moving toward her with the determined momentum of someone who has been waiting to do something specific and is now doing it, which turned out to be taking Clara's face in both hands and saying, "Good, just that, just the one word," and then releasing her. The woman from the western parcel shook Clara's hand. The 2 settlers from the feed store nodded. Trout, the man with the water dispute, stopped beside Caleb and said quietly, "Your father's lawyers came to see me last week, tried to renegotiate the water access terms." He paused. "I told them no. Figured I'd wait to see how today went." He walked out without further comment. Caleb stood in the emptying courtroom and thought about what Ferris had said weeks ago. Word had spread. People, had been watching. What? He found out what his father had decided 3 days later. A letter arrived at the hardware store, left with the owner for Caleb. It was in his father's handwriting, which was the same large, deliberate script that appeared in ledger entries and on the back of land maps in which Caleb had known his whole life. He stood on the street and read it. It was not a long letter. Victor Whitmore was not a man who used language decoratively. He wrote, "I received your letter. I have instructed Holt not to file an appeal. The matter is closed. I won't say I understand the choices you've made. I will say that I know what Dortch did, and I didn't let him go for it. Make of that what you will." There was no closing, just the signature. Caleb read it twice. He folded it and put it in his coat pocket. He didn't know what to make of it, or rather he knew that making something of it would take longer than an afternoon on a street corner. His father was not a man who changed, or who admitted to having been wrong, or who would ever look at what had happened and call it a mistake. But he was also, somewhere underneath the land maps and the lawyers and the empire he'd spent 30 years building, a man who knew the difference between a thing that was wrong and a thing that was necessary, even when he chose the wrong thing anyway. That was not redemption. It was just complicated. It was the complicated thing that fathers and sons are to each other when neither of them is simple. He kept the letter. He rode out to the cabin that afternoon, and when he came around the cottonwoods, he pulled Fletcher to a stop because something was different, and it took him a moment to identify what. The front door was open, not just unlatched, open wide, the way you open a door on the first warm day of spring when the air outside is finally something you want inside the house. The sky had gone a pale, particular blue that belonged specifically to the moment when winter admits it's done, and there was mud on the ground that had been frozen solid for months, and Clara was standing in the open doorway with her arms crossed and her face turned up slightly to the light. She heard Fletcher and looked over. "The judge's order came," she said. "The official copy. Ferris sent it with the morning rider." He climbed down. He walked to the step where she was standing, and she held the document out, and he took it and read it, which didn't take long because it was exactly what Penway had said in the courtroom, written out formally with the court's seal on it. He handed it back to her. She looked at it for a moment, then at him. "I need to put this in the tin box," she said. "Yes," he said. "With everything else," she said, "with my father's filing and the survey and all of it." He understood what she meant. She was saying that this document was going into the same place as everything her father had kept, that it was joining that record of things that had been fought for and held on to, that it was now part of what the family had. She went inside. He followed. The tin box was on the table. She folded the order carefully and placed it on top of the other documents and closed the lid. She set it back in its place under the floor. She stood up. From the back room came the sound of Thomas engaged in something that involved repeated impact. Not alarming, just the sound of a small boy expressing himself physically in a contained space. Hannah's voice, firm and patient. "That is not what that's for." A pause. "I mean it, Thomas." Clara looked at the floor where the box was, and then looked at Caleb with something resolving in her expression. "I don't know how to do this," she said. He waited. "This," she gestured between them with a slight motion of her hand, not dramatic, just indicating the space. "Whatever this is, I don't know the rules of it. I've been running this family for a year and a half, and I know the rules of that. I know how to make a hard decision and live with it. I don't know how to—" She stopped. "Let someone else in," he said. She looked at him. "Yes." "Neither do I," he said. "Not really. I've been good at being useful. That's different from being—" Now it was his turn to stop. "Present," she said. "Yes," he said. "Present." They looked at each other in the cabin that Clara's father had built wrong and that she had kept standing anyway through stubbornness and work and the refusal to let go of something simply because it was hard. "I think you've been present for a while," she said. It cost her something to say that. He could hear it in the way she said it, carefully, like a person putting weight on ice and not being certain it will hold. "I think so too," he said. "I just wasn't sure you'd noticed." "I notice things," she said. He recognized those as his own words from the day on the roof. Something loosened in his chest. "Then I'd like to keep being present," he said, "for whatever you'll allow, no conditions on it, no expectations about the shape it takes." He paused. "I just want to be here." She was quiet for a long moment. He let her have it. "I can work with that," she said. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise set to music. It was Clara Bennett working with what was in front of her, which was what she did with everything, and it was the most honest and human version of yes he had ever heard. He nodded. From the back room, a loud crash, and then Thomas's voice, indignant. "That wasn't me." "Hannah." "Thomas." A pause. "Thomas. It was mostly not me." Clara closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she turned toward the back room. "Thomas," she said, "what broke?" "It was already a little broken," Thomas called back. Caleb put his hand over his mouth. "I was not successful at what he was attempting." Clara looked back at him with the expression of someone deeply tired, and also, underneath it, something that had warmth in it, something that she let him see for just a moment before she went to deal with Thomas. Spring came in fits and starts, the way it always does in Wyoming. 2 warm days followed by a late snowstorm, mud and cold, and then suddenly an afternoon so clear and still it felt like the world had been rinsed. The cottonwoods along the creek pushed out their first pale leaves in early April, and the creek itself ran high with snowmelt, noisy and cold, and thoroughly on the correct side of the property line. There was work. There was always work. The cabin needed the south wall properly rechinked. The kitchen garden needed to be turned and planted. A section of the fence along the eastern edge had come down over the winter and needed to be rebuilt before any stock could be managed on that side. Eli, who had turned 12 in March with the minimum of fuss he permitted for his own birthdays, had taken on the kitchen garden with a thoroughness that suggested he had decided to be good at it the way he decided to be good at everything, completely and without announcing it. Caleb was there most days. He had found a steadier arrangement of work in Delridge, helping with surveying work that Marsh occasionally sent his way, which turned out to be something he had a reasonable aptitude for, and some carpentry for a man building an addition to the dry goods store. It was not the life he'd grown up inside. It was smaller in the external sense. Less money, less ease. A narrow room above a hardware store instead of a large house with warm fires in every room. It was larger in every sense that mattered. He and Clara did not perform their arrangement for anyone. They didn't need to. It was visible in these ordinary things. The way they worked alongside each other without needing to negotiate who did what. The way a decision about the fence line or the garden got made between them with a minimum of words because they had, by this point, developed a shared language built from months of shared work. The way she would occasionally, in the middle of something else, say something that was meant only for him. A dry observation, a small piece of honesty, in a tone that was different from the one she used with everyone else. Hannah noticed and said nothing, but smiled privately when she thought no one was watching. Thomas noticed and asked Caleb directly if he loved Clara, because Thomas had not yet developed the social mechanism that filters such questions before they reach the mouth. Caleb told him that was between him and Clara. Thomas said that was a yes. Caleb told him to go help Eli with the garden. Eli had not asked anything, but one afternoon when it was just the two of them fixing the fence line, he said, without looking up from the wire, "You're not going anywhere." It was not a question. "No," Caleb said. Eli nodded. He set the next fence staple and drove it in with 2 clean strokes. That was all. There is something particular about being accepted by a child who has decided not to trust people easily, who has watched trust fail and seen what it costs, who has built something careful and self-sufficient around the soft place where trust used to live easily. When that child decides to let you in, not loudly, not dramatically, not with any ceremony, it is worth more than most things. Caleb understood this. He kept it quietly, in the same place he kept the letter from his father. In June, Trout filed his own counterclaim on the water access dispute. Ferris took the case. 2 other settlers, emboldened by what had happened in the Bennett hearing, brought their own land disputes to Ferris's office within the following month. None of these cases were simple, and not all of them would end the way the Bennett case had ended. The law was not a machine that dispensed justice reliably when you put the right things in. But the momentum of people deciding they were allowed to fight back, that the size of an opponent was not the final word on the outcome, that had a life of its own. Ferris told Caleb about it one evening over coffee in the lawyer's office, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting a thing they find interesting but don't want to oversell. "Your case started something," he said. Clara's case, Caleb said. Ferris looked at him. Clara's case, he agreed. Caleb thought about what it meant. That one woman refusing to leave her land had created a small fracture in something that had seemed solid, and through that fracture other people had started to move. Not because Clara had intended it that way. She hadn't been fighting for a cause. She'd been fighting for a home and 3 children and the particular patch of Wyoming ground her father had built something on before the ground took him back. But that was maybe how most of the things worth keeping had been won. Not by people trying to make a point, by people trying to keep something real. He thought about his father, in the ranch house, probably at his desk with his ledgers. The appeal that hadn't come. The one line, "I know what Dortch did, and I didn't let him go for it." He didn't know what his father had become in this, or whether anything in the man had actually shifted, or whether it was just the pragmatism of someone recalculating odds. He suspected it was some mixture of both, and that he might never know the exact proportion. That was all right. Some things didn't resolve into clean understanding. You just carried them. One evening in late July, Caleb arrived at the cabin later than usual, having been delayed by a surveying job that ran long in the afternoon light. The children were already eating. Clara was at the fire. She handed him a bowl without ceremony, and he sat at the table where there was now, after months, a particular chair that was his in the way that chairs become yours in a household. Not formally assigned, just known. After supper, while Hannah and Eli managed Thomas's resistance to bedtime, with the practiced efficiency of siblings who have done this many times, Caleb and Clara sat on the step outside the cabin in the long summer dark, the air finally warm enough to be out in without a coat. The creek made its noise in the distance. The cottonwoods moved slightly in a night breeze that carried the smell of the grass coming in warm from the south. She said, "I've been thinking about the spring." He waited. "The garden did well this year," she said, "better than last year. Eli knows what he's doing with it. And the fence on the east side. If we extend it another quarter mile, we can run more stock on that ground." "We can do that," he said, "before the fall." She was quiet for a moment. The creek moved. Somewhere in the dark, a nightbird said something and went quiet. "I've been thinking about the next year," she said, "and the one after that." She looked out at the dark property, the cabin behind them, the land that was hers in law now, and had been hers in fact since long before that. "I've been thinking about what it looks like, longer than just one season ahead." He looked at her profile in the dark. "What does it look like?" he said. She turned and met his eyes. She was not performing anything. There was no angle in her expression, no careful management of distance. Just Clara, tired and real and looking at him the way she looked at practical things she had decided to work with rather than around. "It looks like this," she said. "You here, all of it. The work and the mess and the children and the seasons and—" She stopped. "I'm not good at saying it." "You're doing fine," he said. "I'm saying I don't want you to keep riding back to Delridge," she said. "Not every night. I'm saying there should be a different arrangement." A pause. "If that's what you want?" He looked at her for a moment. All the things he could have said moved through him and past him, and what was left was something simple. "That's what I want," he said. She nodded. Decisive. The nod that settled things. Then she leaned slightly, and her shoulder was against his, just barely, just the small weight of her arm against his arm, and she looked back out at the property and didn't say anything else, and neither did he, because there wasn't anything that needed adding. They sat that way for a while in the summer dark, with the creek going and the cottonwoods moving and the warm air coming up from the south, and the cabin behind them where 3 children were in various stages of settling, and the land around them that had been fought for and documented and witnessed and ruled upon, and was now, without qualification, theirs. Theirs, not Caleb's, not Clara's alone. Theirs, in the way that things become theirs between people who have chosen each other through something harder than circumstance. Here's what the story doesn't tell you, because stories tend to end at the moment of resolution and leave out what comes after, which is where most of life actually happens. It doesn't tell you that the first winter with Caleb there was harder than Clara had expected, not because of anything dramatic, but because sharing a space with another adult after so long alone required an adjustment. Neither of them was entirely prepared for. that there were evenings when the friction between two strong-willed people in a small cabin with 3 children was considerable, and not everything was resolved by morning. It doesn't tell you that Victor Whitmore sent a letter in the fall, not to Clara, but to Eli, which was either a strange gesture or a calculated one, and perhaps both. It contained no apology. It contained, instead, a brief and practical piece of advice about the eastern fence line and the grazing patterns of cattle on that kind of terrain. Eli read it twice, put it away, and didn't talk about it directly. But the following spring he implemented the suggestion. Neither he nor Caleb ever discussed this. It doesn't tell you that Caleb's grief about his father was not clean or finished, that it came back in unexpected moments. A particular cast of autumn light, the smell of the ranch house's wood smoke carried from somewhere on a cold morning, and that he learned to carry it without letting it live in him. These things are part of it too. The difficulty and the adjustment and the grief that doesn't finish itself on schedule. They don't diminish what happened. They're just what's true. What is also true is this. The Bennett homestead was still standing when the children were grown. Eli became, in time, the kind of careful and competent person that difficult childhoods sometimes make. Not without cost, not without the roughness that comes from having had to be harder than his age required, but capable and clear-eyed and, when he decided to trust something, absolutely certain about it. He took to the land with the commitment of someone who understood at 12 years old what it meant to lose a thing and had decided never to be casual about keeping one. Hannah became a school teacher. She was good at it in the specific way that Clara was good at things, without performance, without sentiment, but with a thoroughness that the students felt even when they couldn't have named it. Thomas grew up to be the kind of man who made people feel, within 5 minutes of knowing him, that they'd been friends for years. This was not a skill anyone taught him. He came into the world with it, which is the most dangerous and useful kind of gift. And Clara, who had stood in the snow with an axe at her side and let a stranger in because the children needed to eat, who had built a life out of the available materials and refused at every turn to be reduced to the smallness of her circumstances. Clara built something she hadn't entirely allowed herself to believe was possible, which was a future that didn't require her to be alone in order to be herself. That was the real victory. Not the courtroom ruling, though that mattered. Not the land, though she would have fought to her last breath for it. The real victory was the discovery, arrived at slowly and with considerable resistance, that needing someone was not the same thing as being weak. That asking for help and remaining yourself were not, in fact, mutually exclusive. That the walls a person builds to survive a hard time don't always have to stay up forever. She learned this imperfectly, the way most true things are learned. She had days when the old instincts came back and she went quiet and handled things alone, and Caleb knew better than to push and sometimes resented it anyway. She had days when the weight of what the previous years had cost her landed without warning, and she couldn't entirely explain to anyone why she was tired. These things are part of the record too. But the mornings when she sat at the table with coffee and the light came through the window at the angle it came in June, and the land outside was hers, and the cabin behind her was full of the sounds of people going about the business of their days. Those mornings were something she had not been able to imagine in the winter of 1885, when she had stood in the snow in a too large coat and measured a stranger's intentions by whether he waited before approaching the door. He had waited. That had been the beginning. There is a version of this story that is about land rights and legal victories and the corruption of powerful men. Those things are in it, and they matter. But the thing at the center of it, the thing it was actually about all along, was simpler and harder and older than any of that. It was about what a person does when they have every reason to stop trusting and they decide, against all available evidence, to trust anyway. And what happens when that trust turns out to have been warranted, and how rare that is, and how much it costs.